Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour, then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the chief leader writer of The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the political journalist Isabel. Oakeshott, welcome to both of you. As ever, let's check out the front pages to start with. Lockdown City's mayor broke lockdown. That is the headline for the Metro, with reports that Sir Peter Soulsby has previously been spoken to by police for breaking restrictions during the height of the pandemic. To the front then of The Guardian, front page of The Guardian is a warning about more local lockdowns, which it says could be on the way. The Eye's front cover lists some of the biggest changes to planning laws since the war in an effort to get the economic recovery going. The Daily Mirror also leads on the Prime Minister's recovery spend, saying that it's not enough to save jobs. An economic recovery story also making the front page of The Times, with the headline, Bank predicts V-shaped recovery from the pandemic. The Financial Times is leading on the US and Europe, condemning Beijing tightening its grip on Hong Kong after a sweeping national security law was passed. The Daily Mail leading with the police investigation into the Shrewsbury and Telford NHS Hospital Trust over hundreds of cases of avoidable baby deaths. On the front cover of The Express is a story about funding secured by the NHS for a wonder drug for people living with cystic fibrosis. And the Daily Star leads with a warning about bog roll bandits being back, with people stockpiling toilet paper once again over fears of a second coronavirus spike. Well, let's get the thoughts then, shall we, of Isabel and Sonia. And we start with the suggestion that more local lockdowns could be on the way. This is the Guardian, after Leicester once again finds itself out of step with the rest of England.
That's right. So a number of the papers tomorrow cover warnings from scientists that the local lockdown in Leicester will be the first of a number of such local lockdowns. There are concerns about a rise in infections in Kent, in parts of London, in North Wales and in Scotland. And there's one particular advisor on the government's scientific advisory body, SAGE, is saying, look, we're going to have to brace ourselves for more of this. And critics of the government's approach on all of this are saying that actually other countries were further out of the woods before they relaxed the lockdown. I think it's very difficult for the government. They don't want to continue the lockdown a moment longer than necessary. Local lockdowns seem the best approach, but they, of course, rely on the effectiveness of the track and trace system, and some questions to be answered about why it's taken so long for the local lockdown in Leicester to be imposed after the first signs of a resurgence in infections there some 11 days ago. So quite worrying, really. I mean, awful if you're in one of those areas and you've just about to prepare to reopen this weekend, if you're running a cafe, for example, and now only to be told that is not going ahead and you don't know when that's going to happen. So really difficult position.
Yes, I mean, I suppose, Sonia, we can look to Leicester for a salutary lesson, but more so possibly even the United States, which is seeing a spike in many cases now. The Vice President, Mike Pence, saying they're focusing on 12 states with spikes, putting in additional testing and PPE, but a real concern in America if you don't get a grip of this virus.
That's right, and scientists have been questioning the government's approach for some days now. So some very senior scientists, so David King, the government's former chief scientific advisor, saying that he thought it was really too early to be relaxing lockdown restrictions, the extent that they are being on the 5th of July this weekend. And really the concern is that if you relax too early while daily infection rates still are, fairly high, they're much lower than they were 8 weeks ago, but they're still higher than they were in parts of Europe before parts of Europe started to relax. And then, as Isabel says, having an effective test, track and trace scheme, so you can basically identify local hotspots, whether it's a factory or a school, as soon as it happens, and then take action and track contacts. That's the only way to avoid a second wave of infections, really, or to minimise a second wave of infections. And experts simply just don't think that we've got that in place, and that the government has been talking about the 5th of July, US Independence Day, as for some reason, as the day when everything was going to get relaxed. That was weeks ago. They couldn't have known where infections would be at this point. So I think there's a real worry that the government is putting politics before the nation's health. And the concern is that that could actually just backfire, not just for the government's political fortunes, but also for the economy, because obviously everyone wants the economy to get up and running as soon as possible. But it could be much worse for the economy if we relax too early. We have a big second wave, and then far from lots of local lockdowns, what happens if we need another national lockdown? That could be really dreadful for the economy. So I think there is a lot of concern still. We're going into this weekend, and it's meant to be the big reopening of the economy. There's a lot of concern about whether it's too soon, and kids still aren't back at school yet, and yet we're sort of managing to reopen pubs as a country. What does that say about us?
Yeah, and the Metro focusing on the Leicester Mayor, Isabel, as well, suggesting this is yet another political leader who managed to break the lockdown, the original lockdown.
Well, I'm happy to say that this one is a Labour politician, and a career politician at that. It's extraordinary that the Mayor of Leicester was busted not once but several times during the height of the lockdown for visiting his girlfriend. Now, I've not been one to criticise other people that have been exposed for breaking the lockdown. I've broken the lockdown myself. Everybody knows that, thanks to the Guardian newspaper. But it's rather different, isn't it, if you're a mayor, you're an elected politician, and you're telling other people not to break the lockdown. This was a bizarre error of judgment on the part of the Mayor of Leicester, and I would have thought he will pay quite a heavy price for it. This is a guy that's been in politics for decades. It seems just weird that he could have thought he could have got away with it, really. And just very frustrating for the government, again, that politicians like that are confusing the message, though they will be relieved that he is not a Tory mayor.
Meanwhile, today, obviously, Boris Johnson... Sorry, Sonia, go on. You wanted to say something.
I was going to agree with Isabel on that, and also add that I think that the Mayor's got questions to answer, because he has sort of flip-flopped a bit. And while other Labour politicians have said, actually, if anything, we're doing this lockdown too late, he yesterday was questioning the need for a lockdown at all. And I think there are real questions for him and also for Leicester Council, because the Guardian is reporting today that this sort of outbreak may be linked to Leicester's garment factories. And we know that illegal working practices are rife in some aspects of the garment industry in Leicester. You've got women who are brought in from South Asia to work in these factories for an absolute pittance. And apparently the Guardian is reporting that some of these factories operated throughout the lockdown when some workers were sick. They were still being forced to go into work. So huge questions for health and safety executive, but also, the local authority. Why wasn't more done to clamp down on these illegal working practices?
Yes, indeed. So, I mean, one we spoke to today denied they'd been open throughout, but no doubt possibly questions need to be asked elsewhere. Meanwhile, Isabel, the big reveal then today from Boris Johnson in terms of his economic vision of where we go from here. The eye focuses on planning laws, elsewhere on jobs. What did you make of what he said and suggested?
Well, look, I totally want to be inspired. I want to have something to feel optimistic about the future. And that's what Boris Johnson tried to do today, setting out this vision for the boom in house building and other infrastructure projects that he thinks will happen if there is a big relaxation in planning laws. I mean, I've been around long enough to have reported on pretty much every government for the last 15 years, and probably well beyond that before my time, promising big relaxations in planning laws. It isn't as simple as that. You can change the law on the face of it, but there are so many other elements to the planning system that just take a completely unbelievable time. You've got local authorities spending ages poring over things. You've got utility companies that won't give you the go-ahead for certain bits of the infrastructure. So it isn't just a kind of magic button that can be pushed. And also, this feels a little bit premature to me. We're just about to go into, it looks as if, unfortunately, more local lockdowns. You know, people's children still aren't back at school. By September, many children will have had no formal education for months on end. And yet we're talking about some great big programme of house building as being the salvage of the nation. I just can't really see it. It didn't really do it for me.
Yes, I mean, he talked about urgently getting some of these projects underway. But if you look at the Daily Mirror, you know, the instant job problem you've got after furloughing, you know, once, you know, theoretically the economy gets back and going, who knows what will happen? We've had a series of jobs news today, which makes rather grim news, doesn't it?
That's right. And I think if you look at, I actually completely agree with Isabel on this. And I think if you look at the speech as a whole, there was a lot of rehashing of announcements, quite an incremental amount of money in terms of spending on infrastructure. I mean, this was trailed as a sort of Rooseveltian New Deal. Actually, it's a tiny fraction of the GDP that was spent in the US to get the economy back on track, just £5 billion. And there wasn't, you know, as the Mirror rightly says, that there wasn't much on there on kind of retraining and skills, which is what we're really going to need in place for people who are losing their jobs. Some people's jobs are going to disappear in some sections of the economy. They're never going to come back. And if they're not going to sort of have to sit around on benefits for 20 years, no one wants to do that. There has to be sort of retraining programs open to them. And the speech had very little to say on that. To me, it felt like incremental pots of money, some of which were re-announced, that really don't go far enough to what the nation needs to get it back on its feet.
But if we look at the Times, the Financial Times also has this on its front page. The Bank of England's chief economist talking about a V-shaped recovery, already suggesting it's not as bad as the bank had anticipated. Presumably there'll be fingers crossed all round for this, Isabel.
You know, fingers in V shapes, depending on what side of the political divide you are. I mean, look, he wasn't being overly optimistic there. It sounds great. It makes a fantastic headline, but he is saying these are very early indicators and they may be a sort of temporary bounce back. I really hope he's right. It would be fantastic if there is a V-shaped recovery, but it seems really quite hard to imagine that as realistic when so much of the country's business remains sort of stagnated or frozen, unable to get back to any kind of normality. Huge sectors of the economy have their hands tied behind their backs at the moment. They've had, you know, they just can't in any way get back to any kinds of viable money making. So, you know, unfortunately, many people are, you know, with much better qualified to comment on this than I do, are predicting something an awful lot more flatlining than V.
Yes, it's a long road ahead, certainly, isn't it? Most certainly. We'll see you in just a moment. Coming up next, the former Prime Minister Theresa May attacks Boris Johnson's choice for a new national security advisor. More on that story after the break. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me this evening, the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the political journalist and author, Isabel Oakeshott. Welcome back to both of you. So let's go inside the newspapers now. The fallout of the departure of Sir Mark Sedwill and Theresa May, Sonia, speaking up in the House of Commons today.
Yes, and I think people watching this debate would have found it quite extraordinary, actually. So May really did lambast Michael Gove and the government in incredibly strong terms, which is very unusual for the Prime Minister's predecessor to do directly in the House of Commons in this way. So the issue at stake is really that we've heard over the last few days that Mark Sedwill, who is a cabinet secretary but is also national security advisor, will be stepping down from those two jobs. It's certain that it certainly looks like he was sort of pushed to go by Boris Johnson, who would like to put his own people into those jobs. And the source of controversy is really that the post of national security advisor has always been done by a civil servant. It's a non-political role. But Boris Johnson has decided to make it a political appointment and put his Brexit negotiator David Frost in there, who a lot of security people think doesn't have the CV that you would need to be a good national security advisor. And that is what May was criticising Johnson and Michael Gove for in the Commons today. But it was really quite extraordinary because of the tone with which she did it. It's very unusual for a former Prime Minister to criticise their successor from their own party like this.
Yes, and your thoughts quickly on this. I mean, everyone's suggesting that perhaps the chief Brexit negotiator is going to be rather busy in the next few weeks at the very least, Isabel.
My thoughts are, if you haven't seen Theresa May attacking Michael Gove in the Commons on this, please have a look at it on YouTube. I just couldn't believe to see Theresa May speaking like that. It was really very, very entertaining. But she's right. She does have skin in this game. Mark Sedgwill was very much Theresa May's person. They were very, very close. So she's very upset on a personal level, I suspect. But she's got a point. The new appointee just does not have what would normally be regarded as a suitable CV for this incredibly important post that he's been put in. I think it's a pretty questionable decision, actually.
Yes, and just quickly, both of you, Daily Star doing what the Daily Star does. This is really talking about bog roll bandits back in Leicester. I don't know if this is suggesting we're going to be back in this situation nationally. Let's hope not. Sonia?
Please. Stop it already. Who is doing this? Apparently people are starting to stockpile loo roll again. Why? Don't do it.
I'm sceptical. I think we had a lot of reports of stockpiling sort of early on in the lockdown. And actually, when people worked it out, it was just basically people stocking up their cupboards for a couple of weeks, which is what they'd been told to do. And that was enough to empty the shelves. So I think on the whole, people have been pretty well behaved during this pandemic. They haven't gone out and done tons and tons of panic buying, but it does make for a nice newspaper splash. And I think that's probably what the Star's done here.
It does indeed. Lovely to see you both. Thank you very much indeed. See you soon. Thank you.